Great. Thank you, Allison, and thank you all. Thanks to our hosts for having us today. We're going to start by going through a process we call ORS, which is outcomes, agenda, roles, and rules. And this is something we do at the start of every meeting to set the parameters, make sure everybody's starting from the same place. And so I'm going to start by showing you our outcomes for today's meeting. And this shouldn't be this should be familiar because it was on the promotional material. We're going to help you learn the importance of balancing content with activities for engagement. We think both of those things are equally important. We're going to explore tools for obtaining feedback and fostering group collaboration. And we're going to actually have you experience one of those. And we're going to discuss best practices for navigating the virtual environment for successful meetings. Our job here is to help make you more successful. Next up, we're going to show the agenda. And we do this even when we have sent out an agenda in advance, which we always do, just to confirm with folks what we're going to be doing. So you can see at the top, we're going through our ORs right now. We're going to go into talking about the importance of connection activities. And then we're going to start talking about some best practices that you can begin implementing right away. We're going to show you some collaboration tools that we have used. We're going to end with a closing activity that you will experience. And then, as Jordan said, we're going to stay in this Zoom room for 15 or 30 minutes afterward. And this is also a best practice that we use consistently. We're using it here because we have such a tight time frame and we want to give time to answer any of your questions. In a business meeting, we would use it to help facilitate, as it says on the slide, coffee conversation, the kind of casual conversation you would have in an in-person meeting while you are getting your coffee or putting your schmear on your bagel. The next thing we're going to talk about is our roles for today. And I'm calling this roles for today specifically and I'll tell you why in a moment. So this is what we want you to do while we're in this hour-long meeting. We really want you to fully engage and step into this learning opportunity to take in information, change your mind about things if you get new information. Try to look for 2 or 3 takeaways that you can put into use right away next week when you're in a meeting, when you're running a meeting, and to interact and participate as appropriate for you. Alison and I have roles as well, and our jobs here are to provide the content, to manage the time, and to help stimulate participation. Now, these are our roles for this type of meeting today. I want to show you a slide that is a sample set of roles that we would show in a business type meeting. And so this would be something that we would use, say, for a board meeting, a board retreat, where we want to encourage people to both talk and listen, to both contribute and absorb, again, to change their mind when warranted, to respect other opinions and to seek common ground, to build on what they hear. And we're constantly working with people because of the nature of our work to stay at a strategic level and not get down in the weeds about things. In those sorts of meetings, Alison and I manage the time and keep the process, and then we also stimulate conversation because it's important that our participants interact with one another. That's how we get to the best decisions and best processes. We'll show you a set of ground rules for today. It's pretty short. We do encourage you to think creatively and expansively, which I've decided is consultant speak for think outside the box. We invite you to be an inquiry while you're here, look at things from a new perspective, and we invite you to add your voice and ask your questions, often via chat. And as Jordan said, because of our time frame today, we're going to have some set times that we're going to invite you to do that. Now, this next slide is a set of sample ground rules that we often use in the business meetings we're designing and facilitating. Some similar, think creatively and expansively. We put that at the top because we really want people to come into these meetings with permission to think in a different way. We also, part of our job as facilitators is to balance participation, but we also invite the room to help us do that. So we ask people to both step forward, which is to bring their topics to the table, and to step back, which is to make room for other people to also participate. We want to make sure that there's room for both introverts and extroverts. We invite people to share all of the relevant information so the group can make the best decision. We often ask people to have one conversation at a time in this virtual setting because it's so easy to step on one another. We don't assume that silence equals agreement. If there's a point made or a discussion and there's no conversation, we'll stimulate the discussion or we'll ask people, gee, Jennifer, what do you think about that? Or Betsy, we haven't heard from you. Maybe you could weigh in here. There's a little, I'm not sure I'd call it an acronym. There's a set of letters there. DWYGDT, do what you've got to do. We know that people are sitting in a lot of Zoom meetings now. We invite them to stand up, to use the restroom whenever they need to, and not make themselves uncomfortable just so they can be in front of the Zoom screen the whole time. We also make use of a parking lot in a very specific way. We will ask people if something is getting into what I call excruciating detail. As facilitators, we'll stop the conversation. I'll often do this, or I'll invite the room to do this, anybody who wants to. And we'll put the topic on the parking lot, and then at the end of the meeting, we assign everything on the parking lot somewhere. We don't deal with it. That's not what this meeting is about. We make sure that it's assigned so it can be dealt with. So that's a sample slide for you. The next thing that we do as we move in our virtual meetings is we have this slide up, and actually we normally would have this slide up as you were logging on. And this is a reminder to people to really remove some distractions from their workspace. And so we ask people to do at least one of these. We'll have the slide up while people log in, and then we bring it up again as we go through our ORs. And then finally, we know that although people are sitting on a lot of Zoom meetings, not everybody has got the same training in how to use some of the interactivity. So I'll show you this now, and then we also use it in our meetings as well. I'm going to show you this because we're going to invite you to use these features. When it's time to have some conversation, we'll invite you to use the raise hand icon. If you haven't used it before, you go down to the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, and you pull up your Zoom menu bar and click on participants, and there should be an icon at the bottom of that that says raise hand. And so you could raise your hand and we would see that and we would call on you. We also then invite people to use chat. And so we'll show you here where chat is. We do this in our meetings as well. Same place in the Zoom menu bar, open up the chat button. And actually right now I'm going to invite you to flood the chat by typing your favorite color into chat right now, so we can see that folks know how to use the chat. I think you do know how, but we see lots of colors coming in. That's great. So let me turn things over to Alison to talk really about the importance of connectivity in this virtual world.
Thank you, Dan. Connecting in the virtual environment is very important, and I do a lot of in-person strategic planning and retreats and trainings. And when this whole world changed for us, I thought, well, how am I going to do this and have the same level of connectivity, which creates teamwork and engagement in the virtual environment? And one of the things that's really important is to have activities that you set throughout your presentation or your training or your meeting where you're keeping people involved. And particularly if you're trying to engage a group that may not know each other very well, or maybe they know each other but have not had a chance to visit, there's a variety of things that you would want to do in the virtual environment. One of the things to think about is your connectivity activity will depend on in how you do it with the number of people you have. If you have a meeting of around 20 or under, you can ask a question at the beginning of the presentation or of the meeting, and then do a round robin, which is where you call on each participant and ask them to answer the question. And we have a variety of questions, and I'm going to pop those up in a minute to give you some examples of things that you might choose to do. If you have more than 20 people, typically we would go into a breakout because it is too many to do if you have more than 20. This does take about 15 to 20 minutes of your meeting, and so it's something you have to consider. However, I would say it's probably an invaluable way to have your people enter the room, because there's two ways. You enter Zoom, but you want to make sure people are present, and when you have them talk and share, then they are present in the meeting. Here are a couple of questions that we typically ask, and we'll go round robin and have people respond to them. Name one thing on your bucket list and why. If you could have dinner with anyone dead or alive, who would it be and why? Where is your ideal vacation destination? If you were a superhero, what power would you have and why? And what is the topic of conversation that you would most like to have with the people in the room today? These are just a sample of things that we go through, and you would be amazed at how that brings people in. And even people who've known each other for a long time and maybe have worked together will discover something new about their colleagues. It's something it's actually can be quite fun. So as we move on, like I said, this does depend on the configuration of your meeting. And so we wanted to understand a little bit about you as an audience so we can tailor our comments today based on the type of meeting that you're running. And it could be a business meeting or a training or a community meeting or what have you. But we're going to launch a poll, and the question on the poll, so go ahead and pop that up, is what is the length of meetings that you're planning, and choose all that apply. So go ahead and respond to the poll, and we'll just pause for a moment while people weigh into this.
Oh, they're quick. They're
Yeah,
responding
this is
quickly.
great. Great. This takes some time in our experience, Dan, but it also depends on the question.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
most people are, 1 to 2 hours. I know that people often groan when they're thinking about more than 2 hours on a Zoom meeting, and there are things that we can talk about what you would do when you're having a much longer meeting. And it looks like just about everybody is done with the poll, and most people are doing between 1 to 2 hours, the majority, and then half-day meetings. About a third of you are doing half-day meetings. So we'll tailor our comments to that. So Dan, you can go ahead and end the poll and then close that. You may need to close this on your screen. It may not automatically do that for you. So a couple things to think about, and I'll just cover this very briefly, but if you are doing a longer meeting, it's really important to break it up. And we feel that 5 hours is the max that you can do a meeting, and we encourage clients not to do that, but really to stick to 4 hours. And even with 4, it's a long time. And some groups need longer to work through what they're doing, and so we encourage a more than a one-day meeting if you have to go more than 4 hours. But 1 to 2 hours is really doable. But what I would say is 1 hour is not very long for a meeting, because typically once you do the connection activity and you move from there, you don't have a lot of time left actually in your meeting for the true substantive things, in particular if you're trying to get to consensus on a particular item. So that's one of the things that I would suggest that you really look at when you're planning your meeting. And we'll talk about that in a moment around what we're going to do in our best practices section. So I'm going to cue this up for Dan, and we're going to move to that best practices.
Great, thank you. So we want to give you some best practices that are broken out in a few ways. We're going to talk first about the meeting preparation and the logistics, sort of preparing for the meeting. And one of the things to really be aware of is that the virtual environment requires more time. And part of that is because as we've already talked about, there are connection activities that you want to build in. So you want to make sure that you are allowing for that. The other thing is that as you transition from one section to another or from one technology to another, which we're going to sample for you a little later, you have to build in time for that. Not everything is instantaneous in the world, and so you want to be aware of that fact. As you are planning your meeting, what we do for any meeting, no matter how long it is or what level of complication it might be, is we create a document that's called a run of show. And it's a 3-column document that IDs who's doing what. It has the time frame, the module name that we're going into, who's speaking, and who's doing the tech and what the tech is. And in fact, Jordan, I think, is going to put into chat the run of show for this presentation that we're doing, so you can get a sense of what that's like. So if you want to look at that, you can click on that link. We'll also send a copy of that around so you have maybe a little cleaner copy of it. But you can see the kind of preparation that we're doing in advance. We also always do a tech check. And so even for this presentation yesterday, Jordan, Alison, and I all logged on together for about 45 minutes and went through how everything was going to run. And we will often do that. We also, of course, want to make sure that any co-presenter that we have is prepared, that they're not caught by surprise, that they understand where they're going to be speaking and what their topics are. But what we are finding sometimes is not everybody is totally tuned in to how these virtual meetings work as a presenter. And so you really want to give people enough time to practice with the technology. The other part of preparing for the meeting is being very clear on your agenda and your outcomes. And no matter what meeting Alison and I are preparing for, we focus on the outcome first. What is it you want this group to do by the end of the meeting? A decision that they need to make, discussion or input that they need to have, whatever that is. And then we design the meeting to get to that desired outcome. And of course, then what we want to do is develop a brief agenda, an overview that gives people a sense of how they need to prepare for the meeting, who's going to be there, and what the length of time is. And we want to send that in advance, always, always, always in advance. I actually learned from somebody who said, no agenda, no meeting, which I love. And so you want to give people the ability to succeed when they come to the meeting with you. So that's a little bit about preparing for the meeting. As you get into actually starting the meeting, and I want to talk a little bit here about sort of setting the meeting environment and the atmosphere. Very often what we will do is on the agenda publish that we're going to be in the Zoom room 15 minutes before the starting time. And we do this for a very similar reason that we're having coffee conversation at the end today. We want to give people the ability to connect with one another in a more casual way that we really think people are missing right now. That ability to just have a quote unquote hallway conversation. So we'll open 15 minutes early, we'll greet participants as they come in, ask how they're doing. If folks are in different parts of the city or different parts of the country, we'll ask them where they're from. And we're really trying to encourage conversation between them in this very informal time. You may also know that Zoom gives you the ability to rename yourself, or in some cases, to rename, if you're the host, to rename participants. This is important for a couple of reasons. Sometimes people are calling in, and often when they do that, what's displayed on their video feed, or what would be their video feed, is their phone number and not their name. And so you don't know who that person is. Nobody else in the Zoom meeting knows who that person is either. So you want to ask them to rename themselves, or if your Zoom is set up, you can rename them. The other thing about that is that sometimes people will both video in on the computer and call in to get the audio. That works better for them. And so you have somebody named Dan, and then you have a 415 phone number. You want to match those. So you want to have Dan rename his phone so that it says Dan Goldie's phone. And again, so you have a good sense of who's in the room. It's also because if you do breakouts, you need to put both Dan's video and Dan's phone feed in the same breakout room. Trust me, we learned this the hard way. Otherwise, Dan can see in one breakout room and only hear in another. It's not pretty. So let me turn things over to Alison to really talk about the next steps when you're actually in the meeting.
Thank you, Dan. The connectivity in the meeting is really important. And when we're working with a team that we're wanting to create consensus and engagement and participation, we actually ask everybody to keep their video on. And I know for some groups that's not been the practice, but that's something that we really say in the type of collaborative environment, your video really needs to be on unless you need to step away from your computer. That will help you have success in a whole variety of things that you're working on. Another thing that's important, and this goes back to referencing your agenda, it's really important when you're looking at your agenda that you balance activities, and this is particularly true if you're doing a little bit longer meeting. For those of you who are looking at 4-hour meetings, you want to have a content, but then interaction, and make sure that they're mixed up or interchanged throughout the meeting. Because if you don't, people are just feeling talked at on Zoom, and they get tired, they get Zoom fatigue. I've heard that in many of my leadership meetings that I've been working with, that people just they're Zooming if they put it too much, and they're having that kind of fatigue. So I know most of you are doing 1 to 2 hour meetings. Some of you are doing longer. But my question to you, and I'd like you to write this in chat, is can you tell me how long you think you can go before you should have a break in a meeting setting? So go ahead and type that into chat. Let's see what people think. So 1 hour, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, 90 minutes.
90.
Got a whole variety of things. best practice that Dan and I use typically is 1 hour. However, I do know that, a 25-minute break can be helpful to stimulate and stand up, but if you have a tight timeline, that's really difficult to do. So when we're planning our agendas, every hour we have a 5-minute break. If it's a longer meeting, we put a longer break in, and then if you're doing a 4-hour meeting, we suggest a couple of 10-minute breaks. And then also you have to consider if you're going to be having a meal period during your meeting. So either schedule around that, or if you have that time period within your meeting, you'll need to give enough time for people to grab their food if you're doing a working lunch or that type of thing, or pause for 30 minutes for lunch or what have you. When we do a board retreat, typically that's 5 hours, we do take a 30-minute break for lunch to give people a chance to refresh themselves. Dan, in a funny way, calls them B-FLABs, a body fluid level adjustment break, because it's very important that we all take care of ourselves and also keep people, fresh. Another thing is that, to use a timer when you're actually doing your break. We put up a Google timer. There's a whole variety of them. I'm sure, if you Google it, you can find a bunch of timers. We found one that's kind of fun that we call the disco timer, because it has very lively music that brings in, a little bit of energy into the room. And so we actually put that on and encourage people to dance around with their camera off, just to refresh themselves. Another very important part of the interaction during the meeting is to encourage input. Now, we've talked about a couple of things throughout about how you do that. You can use chat, which is really effective, particularly if you have a lot of people in the room. The other thing that you might look at is to raise your hand and use the participants window to do that. Chat has its pros and cons. One of the things that I find is if you're really looking to stimulate some conversation among a group and get ideas, or maybe there's a thorny subject that you need to discuss, if people are just putting ideas in chat, you're not having that human interchange of ideas. And so depending on what you're doing in your meeting, I really would encourage participation through actual verbal sharing, and doing that by queuing people up, using raise the hand. And when you have a large meeting, you just let people know where they are in the queue and that you'll be getting to them, and you can do that in chat as well. And you'll see we're going to do a little bit of that later in terms of how we use chat in the participants window together. Calling on people also may be a way for participation. Often what we find is if I paused right now and said, do you have any questions, or did you have any comments about what blah, blah, there'll be this big pregnant pause. And online that typically happens because people are afraid of talking over one another and they may not want to do that. And so I always say raise your hand so that I'm able to call on them and we can still stimulate participation. The other thing is that if nobody says anything, there's a speaker best practice that we always say, you take a cup, and whether you have water in it or not, you pause for as long as it would take you to take a sip of water before you move on when you're waiting for someone to respond to your question, or if they have comments. That's another thing that you can do. And lastly, another part of that is if people really are not engaging and you want them to engage, or it's really important that they engage, you can call on people. Like you may say, Christina or Steph, why don't you give me a thought about where you are? And we're not picking on people. The thing is we're trying to stimulate conversation, and that can be very important depending on the type of the meeting that you're in. So there's the round robin encouragement where I actually would go person to person to person and call on them. When I do that in a smaller group, a group under probably 10, I will post the speaking order in chat so people know when their turn is coming. If I am doing it with a larger group, I typically go through my roster for the meeting and do it alphabetically one way from A to Z. And then the next time I do the round robin, I do it from Z to A, so it changes around the speaking order. Those are a couple of different ways. Then you can always popcorn, or that's what Dan and I call it when we say just input, just pop out and say what it is that you're doing. And when we work with groups a lot, we have multiple clients that we work with on a regular basis. The popcorn works fairly well because people know each other. And it's really, really important to just make a conscious effort to help people connect throughout. Another thing to think about is when you have a break, when you come back, check in. And I'm going to give you an example right now of how you could do that. So if we took a 5-minute break, as people come back in the room, one of the things I do is say, please make sure you turn on your video once again so we know you're back in the room. And then I'll begin and say, hey, I'm going to check in with you. Where are you? Type in chat how you're feeling, or how, what describes you right now. So just go ahead and do that. Right now we're going to practice this just so we can see. And this is a great way to engage people and make sure they're still with you in the room, because that's the connectivity piece. We sometimes tend to zone out when we're looking at a screen all day. So go ahead and type in what describes you right now. You have happy, interested, thoughtful, a whole variety of things. Curious, encouraged, great. Great. This is just a great activity because it also has people check in. Yeah, I could get that. I'm glad I had my lunch before this. So that's a really good way to keep people engaged. And there's a whole variety of tools like this that you can use. The other thing that we think is really important when you're in the process of the meeting is every activity that you do, and Dan talked about this a little bit when we were thinking about designing the agenda, is when you're doing the agenda design, think about what the outcome of the section of that agenda is. And then once you do that, whatever the activity is, you actually want to debrief and have discussion about it. So every section of your meeting, if you have an interactivity, you should debrief. There's almost no point in doing it if you don't debrief, because people need to be able to give their input, and that's part of what you're looking for in the connectivity. So that's the in the meeting part of things. There's a couple of best practices that we particularly like when we're looking at ending the meeting. One of the things is to summarize your outcomes. Get to what you said you're going to do, and then did you do it? And it may have shifted. Sometimes, it's an organic process during the meeting, and you may have thought one outcome was happening, but you ended up with something else. Well, you want to make sure you have discuss what that is. If there are follow-up items, you want to make sure that you get those into the docket of who's going to do what. This is also where Dan was talking about the parking lot. If you had a lot of things in the parking lot that you need to take care of, you want to assign those and make sure that somebody's going to go in and have that on their task list of things to do. The other thing that I really like doing at the end of a meeting is to go around and round robin. And when I say that, I mean ask each individual person, what had the biggest impact for you in this meeting? And you will be very surprised the outcome of that. It's very interesting, because then you can see the impact of what your meeting was. It often also brings together continuity for a group that's working together, because they realize they're actually on the same page instead of all over the map, which sometimes is the case when you're coming in to a meeting. And then lastly, we talked about the coffee conversation. This is so great. We're all missing that time when you're putting the schmear on your bagel and getting your tea or coffee or whatever to connect. And this really leaves that opportunity for it to happen. I've found that in shorter meetings, people will stay. When we've had like a 5-hour meeting, bam, they're gone at the end. So it just depends on the length of your meeting, because people get tired of sitting for 5 hours, but there you go. So we actually have a few moments to pause for questions. We'll be going into some other best practices and actually practicing some of the tools. So if you have a question, please feel free at this moment to type it into chat, or you can raise your hand and Dan or I will call on you for your question. And please, we actually would love to hear what you're thinking or what you're wondering about.
And that raise hand icon is down at the bottom, should be at the bottom of your participant screen. Bueller.
Yeah, I'm taking my sip of water here. All right, does the tech differ for business meetings versus one-off special meetings? Yes, it actually can. Thank you, Thomas. When we're doing the tech for, say, a collaborative meeting where you need to do whiteboarding and what have you, you actually need the tools to do that. We're going to go over that. We're actually going to practice something in a few minutes. in the collaboration tools to show you what that might look like. The other thing that we do know is a best practice that's really important is Dan and I found if you're facilitating, it's really hard to do the tech in the back end, and so you need a partner. One person who can monitor the chat and the participants, and one person who can keep the conversation going. And we've worked together for a long time. Actually, Dan and I have known each other for almost 30 years, and so we just tag team back and forth on that and know each other well enough to do that. If you do not know the person you're working with very well, be sure you do the tech check, and it's where it's very important that everybody knows who is doing what. Like we said, we assigned who is doing which things in this presentation itself.
Got another couple of questions here.
Yeah.
How do breakout rooms work with only one facilitator?
That's a great question. It depends on what you're looking to facilitate. Typically, we have our groups self-facilitate. And so when we push people into breakouts, we make it very clear of who will be the facilitator in the group. So we may say something like the person with the next birthday will facilitate the conversation. And also we'll make it very clear what the instructions are for the breakout so that person knows what they're going to be doing. And you give them just a minute for everyone to figure out who is going to facilitate. If you have a specific topic and it's a facilitated conversation, you would need to have those people assigned ahead of time and put them in the breakout groups for that specific topic if it's a subject matter type of thing. Let's see, there's another question about ideas to get others on the team who coordinate most of the meetings on board with these best practices. That's Diane, that's a great question. And we actually met with a client yesterday who wants us to train their whole department of actually colleagues, of faculty, so that everyone's doing the same thing. I suggest you actually do a training for your organization and do this type of thing that's interactive, where you actually have them participate so they can see the value and the difference it makes in the connectivity in the meetings. I think we've all sat in some really horrible meetings that were not well facilitated, and it really does take that connectivity to make it happen. Let's see.
One more question here.
Yeah, one more and then we can move on.
Survival tips for those of us who don't always have support staff and have to play facilitator and tech support at the same time.
Oh,
That's
Jody,
tough role.
yeah, that's a tough one. Frankly, I have done that. What I would say is you need to pace your meeting, not slow, but at a moderate pace. The other thing is I would recommend you have 2 screens. Absolutely have to have 2 screens. If I had my camera set up differently, I would show you my screen setup. The times that I have facilitated on my own where I didn't have someone to help me with the tech, it was absolutely necessary to have the real estate, particularly if you're sharing slides. Because with the slides, you need to have your participants on one area, your chat on one area, and then whatever the subject matter is. And so I see that you've got 3. I would say that's one thing. Perhaps if you don't have staff, but you're working with a partner, I know that your organization, Jody, sometimes works with partners. I think you were part of the Grant Makers webinar that we did with Steph quite some time ago. You might ask someone who you can count on who would be able to help you. That might be another suggestion. Dan, do you have other ideas?
I think that actually last one is very important, that this is a time, particularly this is a time when we need to rely on one another and to try to help each other in these particular circumstances. Particularly if you can find somebody who's motivated by learning new things. As a human being, I'm motivated by learning, and so I will jump in and try to figure out how to do something in order to help somebody. So if you have that kind of a colleague, that can be really helpful.
All right, we're going to move on actually. Let's see, how do you set up? I'm going to do one more and then we're going to move on. Seth asks, how do you set up multiple hosts so that you can work together? There's actually a setting in Zoom. When we went on with Jordan, she set both Dan and I up as co-hosts. And so when you do that, you can do most things on Zoom. The only thing you can't do as a co-host on Zoom is launch a breakout room. It has to be the host that launches the breakout room. So that's a great way to do it, because otherwise on Zoom, a co-host can do just about anything else that a regular host can do, except for launch the breakout rooms.
And you do that by going into their name in the participants box and using one of the drop downs there.
Yeah, and the host has to do it. The host has to sign people up as the co-host. So I'm going to move on to some collaboration tools because we've been talking at you for a while. Now we want you to actually experience some of the collaboration tools that we use. This is part of what makes interactivity work and why it's really important. And it's also where you brainstorm if you're looking to solve a problem, because usually a meeting is happening because you're trying to solve a problem. Sometimes it is informative, but largely it's probably because you want to get something else done, right? And you want to work together with the group. And so we're going to change our mode here. And I'm going to share with you an activity. And this screen that I'm going to share with you, hold on one second, here we go. And here's a moment. Now I'm having a tech moment where I'm talking and I'm sharing with you what I'm doing. And so typically Dan and I will tag team. So one of us is doing the tech while the other one is talking, because sometimes it gets a little bit crazy in the background. And so this is called a Jamboard, and this is a Google product. It's just in your Google Drive. And we use this a lot when we are doing whiteboarding or collaboration. And so this is an interactivity that we're going to use. And what we're going to do is, Dan, can you post the question in the chat?
I can.
So the question is, do you have examples of things that you've seen that have worked well online? And what I'm going to do is you're going to answer that question and I'm going to type it into my sticky note here. So go ahead and type it in chat, or you can actually raise your hand as well. So what are things that you may have seen that have worked well online as a best practice? I think we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, but we're wanting to know your good things.
Hopefully there are some good
things. I know. I was thinking, I hope you haven't been all in terrible meetings. I know it's possible. Anything that struck you as particularly good? Okay, breakout rooms. Here we go.
All right, and I will read these to Alison. And we have round robin intro. You can see this is a benefit of having two people to do this, but either of us could do this on our own.
Right. What else might we have?
What are some great examples of things that have really worked well in online meetings you've been on? Aha, yes, Miro is a good tool for sticky noting like this too. And sharing a link to a Google Doc or a Google Sheet. Good. Set expectation to have video on during a meeting. Now they're coming in. We love it.
Good. And I always see when I'm doing this that there's a reason why I wasn't a teacher, because I make little mistakes. So what's another one?
Using breakout rooms plus Miro. And screen sharing, as we're doing here.
Okay, what else?
Introduce yourself, then select the next person to introduce themselves.
Oh, I love that one. That's a new one.
We like that. Dedicated note taker.
Absolutely. I would say one of those things that's really important is moving into a breakout and actually knowing who is going to do what. Because I've heard of people really saying that the breakout's bombed. And I see one here, name and pronouns.
In your Zoom name.
In Zoom. The other thing I would say when you're working with breakouts is when you're working with breakouts, you have to post actually your question before you move everyone in breakouts. So if you also have directions, you want to put those in first.
And we'll model that in just a second. Just a couple more here. Using audio, visual, and oral prompts for folks who absorb information differently.
That is great.
So we know from in-person learning that everybody takes in different information differently, so we want to mimic that.
Anything else, Dan?
Let's see.
Then I'm going to show how it moves around.
Okay, record meeting and closed captioning. And we'll do one more, give people, give people a heads up when the breakout session is going to end. I'll be honest, one of my favorite things about Zoom is when the breakouts end and I'm back in the main room as the facilitator and everybody comes flowing back into the main room. It's like you all use the flu powder in Harry Potter.
Right. So one of the things I like about Jamboard is once you have your sticky notes, you can move them around. And so often, like here we have a couple of different things about breakouts. So if we were working with some themes, we would want to theme together, well, here are things to do for breakouts, and here are things to do for just meeting best practices in general, or introductions. We have 2 things in introduction. So this is a really handy tool for when you're working in a meeting. The other part of this is it doesn't just have to be a big meeting. I use this on one-on-one sometimes to brainstorm, where you can just brain dump into this document, and that's very helpful.
I want to just mention that I have just put up a note because I'm also logged into the Jamboard. And so I can be collaborating, and other people can be collaborating if that's helpful to your process. And you can see that sticky notes can be different colors for different themes.
Another thing that we've used are Google Docs, because you can set up a Google Doc, and if you're wanting collaboration, you can have all people working on the Google Doc all at once. It's a little funny because it feels a little magic because people are typing into the same document. But if you're working on a group process, if you tell people, here's a segment of the document that you're going to work on, your name is assigned to this, and then you have them work on that, and then everyone has access to that information. That is a really good tool that you can use if the sticky note isn't big enough and you need more people on it all at once. What I would say is one of the drawbacks of the Google Suite is if you're working with institutions that may have a firewall that they don't have access to Google, you have to check that out ahead of time, because we have some clients, we have a financial client that works with, it's a financial association, and they often have big firewalls because there's a lot of banks and what have you, and they couldn't use the Google Docs. So then you have to find ways to work around doing that. Anything else in this area before I show the slide, come out of this and show the slides again of other tools, Dan?
No, I think a couple of people have mentioned Miro, and I think that's where we're going to go next, to show you some of the other tools that are available.
Yeah, and we just put 4 down, but I will tell you that there are quite a few. Dan and I did a pretty extensive training where we took a training for virtual facilitation and collaboration, and they gave us a whole page of possible things for collaboration. One of the things that we found, because we have used Mural, is it's fine typically when you're working with a group that you work with regularly, but sometimes it's a little complex if you have to train people. If you're using it as a facilitator just to do a visual, it's great. If you're using it with a lot of people who are going to be on all at once, unless you're working with that group regularly, it takes a little bit of time to ramp up and get people comfortable in the tool. I have not used Miro, but that's my next thing to investigate. But there are a lot of great attributes to Miro that I really like. Did you want to add anything here, Dan?
Nope.
Okay. All right. We're going to move on to the next topic, to breakouts, and that came up as a best practice that people liked. I actually have liked it too very much. So I hosted recently a 3-day meeting for one of my clients. It was 5 hours, 3 days in a row, and we used breakouts extensively. The group was a little bit worried about doing that many days of Zoom in a row and that length of time, but because of the interactivity and the amount of collaboration that we did in breakouts, it really made the meeting work. So I'm gonna hand this over to Dan, and he's gonna move you into this next section.
Well, what we're going to do here is have you go into a small group, and we're going to have you discuss a question. And so I'm going to put this question into the chat. And again, this is a best practice. If you're putting people in breakouts, you want to put your question or your instruction into chat before the breakouts start so that they can have it there to see. So we're asking you to discuss in your breakout what in this session was most impactful for you. And we're going to give you a total of about 5 minutes. And the first person to go is going to be the person whose birthday is soonest, closest to today coming up. And then when you come back, we're just going to have some quick discussion about what that process was like for you and what the process of having that conversation in a small group was like for you.
Yeah, and
Okay?
also it's not just that the first person will go with the next birthday, but then they will pick the next person to speak, and you'll do that. Whoever's speaking will pick the next person. All right?
So I think Jordan is going to get us going into breakouts. Welcome back.
Everybody's coming back in. It's always like magic.
Yes, the whole screen fills up.
Excellent. Now we can see everybody now. Great.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Looks like we have everybody back in. All right. So as we said, we don't want to do an activity without debriefing it. So let's have just a little conversation. What was that like to be in that small group and hear about what's been impactful? And we'll invite you here to use the raise hand icon to put something in chat. If you want to respond to that, what was that like for you?
Or what was impactful for you? Actually, either one of those things.
Okay, Jennifer, I'm gonna unmute you. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I would say for me it was awkward because I was the only one on video. No one else seemed to have that capability, so it felt weird to talk to a blank screen.
Aha, good point. Thank you.
And we can add that to our best practices to make sure you're on video.
Yeah, yeah.
Who else?
Seth says he missed the breakout room timer.
You also can send messages as a host into the breakout, but it only stays up for a short period of time.
We have here, I liked that we got to hear what has worked for some and what others are interested in becoming more familiar with. So you got to hear from some of your peers and your colleagues.
Steph, you're on a lot of meetings. Is there one thing that was impactful for you? I'm going to call on you because I know you.
I mean, in terms of the overall webinar so far, I think the Jamboard tool was new to me. You know, I've done collaboration on documents, but not something that has that visual element of being able to move stuff around, which I so often rely on in in-person meetings.
Great.
So.
Thank you for letting me pick on you. Why don't we take some questions, Dan? What do you think about that?
I think that's a fabulous idea, Alison. Are there any questions as we roll into the last 3 minutes of the official time? And then Alison and I will stay on to have any more conversation. Questions or things we didn't cover that you have a deep burning question about?
Steph, go ahead.
I am set up as a co-host, so I don't have the raise hand feature. But I'm really curious, you know, what anyone here's thoughts are about things really do work like so much better with video, but I'm often doing kind of broader meetings, not quite, you know, it's still stakeholders as opposed to just the public, but still, you know, folks who they might be volunteers as opposed to approaching it from from a professional context, and they're less likely to have a video set up, you know, or, and so, you know, I'm just kind of wondering about best practices for including folks who might be phoning in to a meeting, which is not the ideal, but you still very much want to include their voice and for them to have a good experience.
That is,
yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Is really making a point to call on them when you can, not in a negative way at all, but to demonstrate to them and to the rest of the room that they are there and they are important. So that's the first thing that I always try to work on.
Yeah, and I'm always make sure when there's someone on the phone and everybody else is on video that I'm super conscious of asking them specifically what it is, can they contribute, is it a good time for them, what have you, because they may not be on video for a certain reason. Also, you know, just be respectful. I had a client recently who was not on video because his children were in the background doing their school, and he said it would be way too distracting, and so I'm just doing it this way, and we just worked with it. And just normalizing the situation is one of the things that I work on. let's go to you, Seth, and I'm going to unmute you. And then there's another
Question in chat.
question in chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oops, I didn't unmute you. Sorry. Jordan, can you do that? I've lost him now. Here we go. Let's see.
You were very good about lowering his hand, though.
Yes, I was. I could do that. I'm trying to get him to unmute, and I can't do it. So, Jordan, can you do that for me?
Hey, sorry.
I was able
Oh,
to
there we
do
go.
it myself.
Okay, there we go. Thanks.
Okay,
Go ahead, Seth.
So back to the breakout room timer issue. In some of the breakout rooms that Steph has organized over the last couple of weeks with the summit, there's always been a timer in the upper right-hand corner. And the only timer we had on this one was the last minute.
Oh, okay.
And I found it helpful in the other sessions to have the timer from the very beginning, so you had an idea of how much time you had to talk.
Got it. Okay.
Good. Thanks. We'll look into
Interesting
that one.
that came up. Yeah.
Yeah. We have from Jennifer thoughts on virtual backgrounds. And I will just say my one experience with that. I do not have a virtual background, and it's because in the environment which I work and I have a door behind me, it won't work because I don't have a solid wall. Dan does have a solid wall. I've had people also just put up a curtain behind them or have some type of folding screen or what have you. So I think there's ways to get around it if you don't have virtual. What about you, Dan? You may have some thoughts.
Well, I'll approach the question from a slightly different way, which is maybe, you know, is it professional or not professional? And you can see what I've put up as my virtual background. And I think it's a way to show people who you are as a human being. And so I'm a proponent of virtual backgrounds. I know that it's not appropriate in every instance. I'm also a proponent if you are working with a public or stakeholder group of having a branded virtual background.
Right. We're at time. I have one more question that I just quickly wanted to say. In terms of tips in your video, you can see that my head is actually pretty squarely in my screen, and I just moved it. You want your head to be very squarely in your screen. You also want to wear solid colors. If you don't, sometimes they can dance around on your shirt. I have a blue polka dot shirt, and I wore it one day, and it was like crazy, right? So you think about that. There's actually good best practices online. I've seen a couple of articles about that. So if you just Google best practices for camera, you can pop that up.
My laptop is on 10 books. It's stacked up on 10 books.
Yeah. So we're at the end of our time. I'm just going to turn it back to Jordan for a moment, and then Dan and I will actually stay and answer any other questions you might have.
Including those that are in chat.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alison and Dan. This was super relevant information for me. At Travel Oregon, we're hosting a lot of virtual meetings, so I was definitely taking notes. Great content. I'm sure everyone agrees. So thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. As Alison and Dan were just saying, we'll hang on the line for about 15-30 minutes if you'd like to chat more. I'm going to drop our survey into the chat right now, our post-session survey. It should take about 2 minutes to fill it out. If you could give us your feedback, we'd really welcome it, and invite you to leave all your thoughts in the survey. Hope you enjoyed the session, and I'll turn it back over to Alison and Dan. Thanks.
Great. Well, we have a couple more questions in chat. There's a question that came into me privately. How would you take the approach with meetings where some people are in the room and some are remote? And I will say I have not had experience with that, so I don't feel qualified to respond.
I have, and I'll tell you, it's extremely difficult. What I have done at one point is I was presenting standing, and I was in the room, and I worked with one of the staff for the organization, and they interfaced with the person that was not in the room, because we had 2 people not in the room, and then we had 7 of us in the room, and it was pretty challenging. And if there's any way you can avoid that, I would suggest it, but I know some people are not comfortable with social distancing to be in the room at this point, so you also need to be respectful. It's best probably to assign one person to be interfacing with the computer. It also is helpful depending on how your setup is. If you have a camera where you can capture more of the room, and if I have a client that they actually have that set up where we were able to do that, so they could actually see me, and we flipped back and forth in that way, and we could see them. But that takes being in the office and actually video. So I don't have a best practice for you because it is really challenging. And from a facilitation perspective, it's really hard because you aren't able to equally do it. I would almost say that if you cannot all be in the room, go all virtual. And I might lean towards that. Because we are more able to have interactivity, and particularly if you're working on an issue where you want interactivity and collaboration, I would go all virtual.
What other questions can we answer? We'll invite you to use that raise hand button or put something in chat. You're probably few enough, you might even just speak. That's something I miss, actually, is not being able to hear your voices.
All right, so Seth asked, how do you set up breakout rooms? First, in your Zoom, you need to have, you need to be host, Seth. And then it depends on, there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. You can randomly put people into groups, or you can assign people to groups. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. And when you pop up the breakout window in Zoom, like to set up breakout, it will ask you to identify how many people you want per room, right? And so you do that right away and just, you pick how many people per room. So I think about this ahead of time. We actually thought about it in this presentation. We thought would be a lot of people, and about 4 people is a good number to have when you have a short period of time. So we made sure that Jordan moved people into 4 things. So when you say I want 4 people per room, what will happen is Zoom will automatically generate that breakout room for you. The thing you have to look for is if there's staff in the room and you're working with leadership, or you don't want certain people in the same room just because it might be 2 leadership people and you want to move them around to get different input, you really have to spend a minute to organize the breakout. I've done that on the fly and it's a little bit hard, so it's better to do it in advance if you can, to organize it. The other thing is if you're trying to mix the groups, while you can randomly assign them, you can also move them around. You can move people from breakout to breakout. You can exchange rooms. You can put all people in one room that you don't want to be part of breakout and then delete the room and they'll pop back into the main room. It takes a little bit of actual experimentation and trial and error, Seth. So what you might want to do, and Dan and I have done this multiple times, is we'll get other facilitators that we know to work together to practice certain things. We practiced one recently where we did where we gave breakout rooms where people could pick their breakout. And so we practiced that ahead of time with another facilitator and got some other people online so we could practice on how it works. Does that answer your question, Seth?
Yeah, I think so. You notice that you have Jordan set up as the host and everybody else co-host. Does that mean that she has to be the person to run the breakout rooms?
Yes, yes. She could have made me host, but then I would have been in control of the whole meeting, and it's Travel Oregon and Trails Association Zoom, and so we just stuck it that way. But I have a client where I used their Zoom and they made me host because I needed to be in charge of the breakouts because of the number that I was doing. I think during that 3-day meeting, I did probably 15 breakouts. So
I'll also just quickly mention that to even set up breakout rooms, you have to go back into your back end of Zoom, log onto your Zoom account online, and enable breakout rooms in the first place. So that's the first step. And any of you who've poked around in Zoom's settings, it's a little frustrating. Yeah. There, you have your account settings and your meeting settings and your, I don't know what else settings. And I honestly can't tell you where the breakout room enabling setting is, but go into your settings and go through all of them.
I feel like I learn something new about Zoom every day, but usually directly from another human.
Right. Or because something didn't work and then you had to go figure out how to do it. I've had that experience too. Cindy had a question about tips for people who aren't allowed to use Zoom. This is a firewall issue, Skype or Teams. I have been on calls with Teams, but I haven't had to do the level of facilitation, because my guess is if you can't use Skype, you probably also don't have access to Google Docs. Would that be correct, Cindy? And you can either unmute and answer, or you can just type it in chat. You know, it makes it a little bit challenging if you have those firewalls where you aren't able to get through, because all the collaboration tools that I know, you have to be able to go into kind of a group setting. I have used GoToMeeting. I don't like the capabilities as much either, but my guess is you wouldn't be able to be on those either. So probably Teams might be your best bet to try, because then you could also probably use some of the Microsoft Docs. Other questions or just comments, or even if it
If other
seems
people
like
have comments for Cindy that you want to put into chat, if you are using Skype or Teams, feel free to do that as well.
And
share your knowledge.
Any question, even if it seems really basic, I've learned some great things from the most basic questions. So even if it feels basic, go ahead and share. We're happy to help you along. Dan and I have done a bunch of training on this, like to receive training ourselves, but then we've also figured out a lot by trial and error. And there are some moments where we've had that, oh my God, this totally isn't working in the back end moment where we're live and you just got to figure it out. Anything else?
You mentioned there was a parking lot feature.
Oh, yeah. Dan, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's not really a feature, and so as such, it can be used across any platform or in an in-person meeting. And so that is, I actually, this is a little bit old-fashioned of me, but if there are parking lot items, I actually write them down on a notepad. And then part of my run of show is always the first thing in the wrap-up is assigned parking lot items. And so then we'll spend however much time it takes to say, all right, so this came up as an issue. Is this still an issue that you want to have follow-up on? If so, who's going to do the follow-up on it?
Another way you can...
We don't leave the meeting without that parking lot being completed.
Another thing that I do, Seth, is I use the Jamboard or a Google Doc, where I write the thing in the Google Doc, and I just set up my Google Doc or my Jamboard ahead of time with a parking lot tab, and then I just put anything in there. And I may not do it live, so it happens in the back of the house where I'm working on it and I have a document, but I do it that way, and then I'll go back and revisit it like Dan. Other questions? Steph.
I mean, this is a little, both the thought of something that works, but something I'm still trying to figure out how to make it work better if folks have thoughts. So a big part of my facilitation training in terms of live facilitation was really scribing notes. Like whenever I was doing any kind of group report back or anything, scribing notes so that people could see that you caught their input and their feedback, and which in my experience has always helped immensely. And letting especially your bigger talkers like feel heard, and like they don't have to keep reasserting that important thing, you know, that
yes, I do know
that they care about. And so, you know, for some things, you know, recently I've started like sharing a Google Doc link ahead of time and saying, like, here is the Google Doc where I'm going to be taking notes during this meeting. And you know, and I'll also often give people like at least commenting privileges to that, if not editing privileges. So I'm saying, you know, if at some point you're sharing, especially something like a link, you know, or something, feel free to just drop it directly in here. So I mean, that's one kind of go around I've seen, but it's still not necessarily in front of people who are just participating and sharing input in a meeting. And so just other thoughts about, you know, kind of tools you like for making sure people feel heard and therefore mentally move on.
Yeah, I actually like your technique, but I actually do it live, and I keep a document live and share my screen with it. We actually recently did, working with a group to do their vision and mission. And when we got down to the pertinent things, we live scribed into the document, and I wrote everything down that people said, and then we moved it around and I worked on it live that way. I do think that the Jamboard works for that, Jen or Steph, as well. The other thing is I use chat One of the things we noticed in one of our groups that has a younger demographic is they were less likely to talk, but they were using chat like crazy after a while. And when we got into like hour 4 of the meeting, this was a longer meeting, they used chat a lot and a lot of stuff came through. And it could be a way to say, is there anything that hasn't been said that you need to say? Put it in chat. Some people are shy or introverted and don't like to speak out. And so using the various techniques, you know, where someone could do it, and I think chat can be used very effectively that way. I like the idea of having, if people can get, unlike Cindy's situation where she can't get into Google Docs, but if they can get into Google Docs and share their thoughts on Google Doc, that might help that. I mean, you do have what I call meeting bullies who are just like blah, 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 and you need them to step back. That's also where we set up the environment for our meeting with the best practice that say, think about when you want to lean in and when you need to step out. And we actually may not call on people or move on if people are dominating the meeting. And I think that's part of the facilitation role as well. Dan, did you have any other thoughts?
Nope. I think Tom has a question though.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. This is kind of just a general meeting question, but I think people have a very hard time sticking to an agenda. And invariably, it seems like with Zoom or with kind of the virtual meeting scenario, we're finding, or I'm finding, that people are being a little more flip with their time. So rather than sticking to a 1-hour meeting because I've got to run to another meeting or I have a call at such and such time, facilitators are just kind of letting meetings go on and on and on. And so I've had meetings that have been scheduled for an hour that have been an hour and a half or 2 hours in length. Just some thoughts and your feedback in terms of how to address that, both from, I guess, when you're a facilitator setting the agenda, but also when you're in the midst of a meeting like that. What are some good techniques to maybe help get that meeting rolling and find a finality to it or an ending to it?
I have a lot of thoughts about that, and I'm sure Dan does too. We are very stringent about sticking to our timelines. And it's rare when I will go over in a meeting. And if I do, first of all, Tom, I say, we are out of time. Would you like to stop now and reschedule, or do you want to continue with this conversation? But I will tell you, it's very rare that ever happens in any meeting that I set up. And one of the reasons is I think very thoroughly through my agenda ahead of time, and I time out my agendas. And they're very specific, even for just a regular meeting, not like a run of show meeting, like we shared with you the run of show, but we were timed to the minute on this particular conversation with you. But when I do a leadership meeting, it's the same thing. And I will keep people to that. And even if we're going on and on with the conversation, I'll say, we're running out of time. Do we have one last comment? I may tell people, I use a technique that is around, think about what you want to share and if it's really going to move us towards the next step that we need to move through, or if we're having one of Steph's moments where people just feel like they need to be heard, and have them be mindful about it and ask them to be mindful. Frankly, I think there's something about having professional facilitation. One of my clients is the SBDC, the Small Business Development Center, and I do professional facilitation for many of their meetings because they need someone from outside who doesn't have a dog in the fight, who's moving them through the agenda topics. But there's a lot of planning that happens with that ahead of time. You know, I've gone through with the leadership everything we're going to cover. There are times also during a meeting, Tom, where you do have to pivot when the conversation may be so rich and you need to continue it. And at that time, as a facilitator, I may say, this is a really rich conversation. If we continue to do this, we're going to have to table 3 other items because our time frame is this, and we will be stopping at the hour or what have you. What you're experiencing in my mind is just really poor facilitation and poor management skills in terms of bringing your meeting together. And it is about being disciplined and timing it out, and specifically showing on your agenda that you give to your participants that we are spending 15 minutes on this topic.
I could add a couple of things here. Because in some cases, someone's going to be facilitating this meeting that you have no control over. And so one of the things that I do is, as I talk about the parking lot, I also introduce what I call the universal specificity signal, which is going like this. And I give anybody in the room permission to go like this when we get into that excruciating detail. And that's when I stop and say, that sounds like we're getting off topic. Do we need to put something on the parking lot? And we'll do that so we can move back into what we're talking about. So that helps the rest of the room, as well as if the facilitator is not able to do it. I would also say, as a meeting participant, if you have the ability to do this, to say, we're coming up on, it's 5 minutes until this meeting was supposed to end, and I have another meeting to get to. Is there anything that we need to wrap up here, or are we going to reschedule this meeting, the rest of this meeting? I try to take control of the situation if I can. I know that's not always possible given who else might be in the meeting, but that's what I do as a participant.
The other thing on that specificity, or that's not coming out right, but Dan's saying, in my ground rules, I actually invoke that anybody can invoke the parking lot and say, we're going to make this part of the ground rule that anybody in this meeting can say, well, that needs to go to the parking lot, because then it gives the participants the ability to say, whoa, this is like way in the weeds. The other thing is just to go back to, is this the question we are meant to answer? Because people go down a rabbit hole. It just happens.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Seth. No, oh,
You're
sorry.
going
This is like an auction. You just scratch your nose and we're
We're
calling
like,
on you.
yeah.
Hi, Seth. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else with questions?
Thanks, Jody. Thanks, Katie.
Well, thanks for sticking in with us.
Yeah, I hope this has been useful. And if there's anything we can do for you or your organization, please don't hesitate to let us know. And I hope you'll take this back and start